Are you the Bitcoin time traveler? G'day crypto goers, Adam Stokes here with a very special guest tonight. In 1998, he warned of the probability of hijacked planes being flown into the World Trade Center. In 2005, he described to a group of Wall Street bankers the pattern that would lead to a global financial crisis just 3 years later. He correctly foresaw the circumstances that led to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. He was amongst the first futurists to anticipate the success of Apple's first iPod and Tesla's electric cars. He also predicted the socio-political conditions that eventually led to the Arab Spring, the release of Burma's pro-democracy leader, and the election of Donald Trump. He is now talking about the collapse of capitalism as we know it and threats to the sovereignty of the EU. Dr. Richard David Hames, I am absolutely honoured and humbled. Thank you for joining me tonight.
It's a great pleasure, Adam. It's good to be here.
Doctor, or Richard, as you invited me to call you, the very first question that we all have from the crypto space is, are you the Bitcoin time traveler?
That's a dilemma, isn't it? Because if I answer one way or the other, I'm going to lose. So we'd better leave that in abeyance. We might come back in towards the end.
Well, that's exciting, but you are certainly aware of the Bitcoin time traveler. So before we revisit that...
And I'm a time traveler. There is no doubt about that.
Well, it sort of leads to the opening of what is a futurist and how does one pursue such a career?
I think there are many translations or expressions of what a futurist is, and in the profession there are three kinds of futurists essentially. There are the academics who come up with theories about the future and tools to use to examine the future, and I'm not an academic. Then there are the pop futurists who tend to follow trends today and extrapolate their assumptions about what will happen based on those trends and patterns. And then there are odd people like me who are really trying to make much better sense of what's happening today at a very deep level, to discern patterns in global society that then make better sense of the dynamics of change, and then it's easier in a sense to begin to propose certain things that are probably going to happen or could happen. So I'm in the latter camp, and I don't know what you call those, but I call myself an anticipatory foresight practitioner.
And what if we were just trying to make a comparison to, say, other futurists? What would we align that up to? What would be at the other end of the spectrum that you described yourself as a futurist? Gamblers?
Oh yes, there's no crystal ball involved. This is a rigorous methodology. It involves not just me, but many, many people indeed. So we use these days machine intelligence to allow us to scan hundreds of millions of documents that are available online in the public domain, so that we can ask questions and build scenarios around certain themes and topics. We have AI also for identifying what I call acupuncture points, particular points in any system that are interesting to look at in terms of the future change. Then we also have a very big network around the world, because what we need are trusted sources on the one hand, and the assurance that those trusted sources are not just Westerners looking through the Western lens at what's happening, but a variety of different cultural mindsets with a different cultural lens on what is happening, so that we get a kaleidoscopic understanding of issues, patterns, trends.
So it's not, as you mentioned, it's not just looking into a crystal ball for any of the skeptics out there. It's like, oh,
no, not at all.
From what you're saying, I'm hearing you using both quantitative and qualitative data, not alone, but in a team.
That's right. That's right. And that's very, very important. Also, we work in what I call the expanded now. So that's, if you like, it's trying to pull from the deep past and the deep future into the present moment, so that we can, if you can freeze time, that's what we would be doing, so that we can forensically examine in great detail what is happening today, what the relationships are, what the key dynamics are, what the current trajectories and the speed of those trajectories are, so that we can anticipate better the speed at which something is going to develop or unfold and the likelihood of certain events occurring or not. And so the conversations that we have in the team are very deep strategic conversations. So most people, if you're thinking about the future and you just join a conversation, it's equivalent to one person saying, oh, look, there's an iceberg over there. And another person in the conversation saying, oh, yeah, I see that iceberg. And there's another one over there. And that's all at the surface level. What we're doing is we're going under the surface, deeper and deeper, to discern the kind of meta system that's in place, the meta belief system that's in place that actually gives rise to those things in the first place. So that in any form of strategic advice we give to a government or corporation, it's at that level of understanding.
You mentioned using artificial intelligence. How does that incorporate into this team talk? And before we get too far ahead into the crypto space, is this AI leveraging off blockchain technology?
Oh, we use blockchain as well, that very often. But yeah, these are proprietary algorithms that we and others have developed. And one or two use blockchain because it's just easy. What we do is really the AI is used for two things. The first is what is traditionally called horizon scanning, where you're trying to take in as much knowledge and information as exists as possible and synthesize it, make sense of it, analyze it, synthesize it, make sense of it. And the other way we use algorithms is to identify those points in the system that from a design perspective would enable us to redesign that system differently so that the outputs or the events that occur would be different.
So for those who want to get into your space, I'm thinking of back to my uni days. I don't remember seeing futurist in the course lineup, but is it fair to say you've got more of an engineering background or an economics background?
No, I'm a very generalist, and the team is very generalist too. I mean, we've got people from all kinds of disciplines and walks of life. There are futures courses. There's a very famous one in Hawaii. The Australian Foresight Institute at Swinburne University was a world famous course and turned out, I don't know how many graduates, but all now around the world working in foresight, either in governments or in the corporate sector. And so there are courses, you can seek them out, and there are some online as well.
Right. So who employs a futurist? You mentioned governments before. So who's your number one customer and why are these people employing you?
For me, the number one customer is governments around the world. And a certain number of corporations as well, but they're mostly corporations that are really trying to transition to a different industry or a different way of doing business. Or they're corporations that are trying to rebrand what they do, or they're startups who are doing entirely new work. So it's a bit unusual in terms of the corporate space, but governments love foresight. In fact, in Australia, just recently, the CSIRO issued a report on the next 2 decades of possibilities in Australia. A CSIRO have their own foresighting capability, and it's a very good one. And they release those kinds of reports on a regular basis.
Yeah, I was watching one of your presentations in Melbourne recently, and you were talking about how quickly everything's moving, and if governments and businesses, in fact, in this talk you're referring to more, if businesses don't have this foresight, they simply are not going to have any opportunity to catch up, which I guess leads me into your success/failure rate. Let's say you make, and perhaps it's not as simple as this, if you're making 10 predictions, what's your kind of success rate in that? Do you expect 50-50, 90%?
No, no, our success rate over the past 25 years has been probably nudging 82, 83% accuracy. Um, and now I don't claim that is unique in any way unique. I think other people are getting similar success rates, but it's how they then apply that knowledge that they get. And the other thing I should say is that that's just not me. It's a team of people, and everyone is responsible for having insights that are then used to project or anticipate what we think is going to happen.
It sounds like it could be quite stressful. I was doing a video last night with Bo Stoner from Cryptocurrency Australia, and we were doing a lot of thought experiments, and we're going down the paths of where crypto is going to take us into the future. And we came to a realization at one part of the conversation. It's quite scary of what we were foreseeing. I'm wondering what was your most scary in your long history or career of futurism and predictions and making these calculations? What's been your most scary or concerning or powerful prediction?
There are several. The ones that keep me awake at night, I guess the top one would be the seeming inability of humanity to cooperate um, to to combat the existential problems facing humanity. And as part of that as well, the inability to break out of this cognitive and emotional threshold that, or gridlock rather, that keeps us doing what we've always done. I mean, we often feel comfortable rebranding common sense and calling it innovation. But in fact, we're not really thinking about the future of humanity from different design ontologies. We can't even step into new epistemologies, and that's incredibly frightening to me, because we know that the shared worldview is becoming more and more toxic. The world system that the worldview has generated is becoming more and more toxic. And yet we're doing nothing except doing the same with more enthusiasm and with greater effort and with more money. So that's the number one. That's the number one threat to humanity. It's not any of the things we read about in the press. Like climate change. I mean, climate change is a misnomer anyway, because what we're actually facing is a complete and utter global ecological breakdown. And it's not just about emissions, it's about water, it's about loss of species, it's about the rising of the oceans and the saltification of the oceans. It's about so many different factors that we really see in compartments only, and therefore don't look at the whole. And that's another problem I see, which frightens me. Silly.
What's the cause, do you think, Richard? Is it greed? Is greed the underlying cause of all of this?
Well,
Because you mentioned stupidity. What keeps us so stupid in this space?
it is the human condition. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to change human nature to such an extent that we actually can do anything about the major things facing us. I mean, what we do is spend billions of dollars trying to get a few people to Mars or a distant planet, and at the same time spend trillions of dollars trashing our own planet. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, one of your talks, it was quite powerful when you said uh, we do in fact have enough food for everyone. And I've often wondered this, is there enough food? And you mentioned, well, in fact, there is enough food. It's just how we distribute it, because some are obese and some are malnutritioned. And yet for some reason, collectively, as a species, we can't seem to redistribute these resources.
Well, it's not just redistribution, of course. It's how we grow the thing, how we use agriculture, how we use our resources. Certainly the population is big. I mean, the year I was born, I think there were about 2 billion people on the planet, and now there are 7.7 billion people on the planet. So that's, in my lifetime, it's just ballooned. But that's not to say we can't feed that number of people. And going out to 2050, where we're likely to have about 9 billion people by 2050, and then it might taper off a little bit, we can still feed those people. But it depends how you want to live. If you want to live like the average American in New York City, then you will spend a lot on transporting goods from all over the world to your doorstep. You won't grow anything locally. You'll pay the earth for that, and you'll throw about a third of it away anyway as waste. On the other hand, if you're a villager in India, then, and we all lived like that, not that we probably want to, but if we did, we could sustain a planet with a population of about 16 billion people. So it's a question of how we want to live our lives and how we manage the resources we've got.
And who makes that decision? Like, who makes the decision of what level is enough? Like, I've thought, who decides what is wealth? And I'm glad you actually mentioned, say, a third world country such as some of the people in India. They're living to a certain standard, and as a prepper, most people in the crypto space are by default a prepper. So if something goes wrong, we've got water and maybe weapons, maybe somewhere a bug out shelter or something like that. And when there's mass disaster, those in second and third world countries adapt far easier to it because they're not falling as far. And in New York, if there was a mass power outage or a lack of fuel or something happened, I mean, where do you get your food from when you're living in a first world country? And comparative to if you're in a third world country and you're so used to living in tough conditions anyway, I guess what I'm pushing at, what is acceptable? What is the standard of acceptable?
Yes, well, one of the problems is no doubt, the Western paradigm, this worldview that I mentioned. It's constructed increasingly around a few things: Western cosmology, scientific realism, capitalism in terms of, well, originally laissez-faire principles, which at least gave it the illusion of being fair, Cartesian logic, that is the right-left, the duality of thinking and debate, things like that. And those are the things that are now not sufficient for our needs, not sufficient for our thinking, and totally insufficient for how we make decisions. So you ask, who makes the decisions? Well, one has to look at incumbent leaders for any generation. And incumbent leaders today are totally out of their depth. They're not geared up to collaborate or cooperate because of the nature of competition. They're focusing on economic growth without thinking what type of economic growth is needed and what type of economic growth is needed here in this geography. Instead, they just think when you become a politician, okay, economic growth is the most important thing we need to deal with, and it is, except that they all think it needs to be in surplus, it needs to grow, it needs to be bigger all the time. Well, on a finite planet such as ours, that's absolutely impossible.
The video I made recently of you, I put in an insert of Dick Smith's video about this continual growth. In his 1 minute video, Dick Smith is talking about pretty much what you were saying, this push to constantly grow, and perhaps this is the cancer that's on the planet. I wonder in the political space, particularly in Australia, you've got this push-pull effect. So you've got the puppets of the voters telling the Prime Minister what to do, but underneath it you've got a different puppet master, which is the cabinet. And so in my opinion, the Prime Minister of Australia is actually one of the least powerful people in the country, because he's got the puppet strings from above of the voters, and he's got the puppet masters underneath from the cabinet, as we've seen with Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, take your pick. They just get fired if they don't do what the cabinet says. So I'm wondering, do we actually have a space in Australia and in many democracies where leadership does actually allow us to steer an economy and a country in a certain direction?
Well, no, this is one of the problems, the problem being that democracy actually isn't working anywhere in the world now. And representative democracy is working worse than any other form of democracy. The reason is that we've become so caught up with ideologically based policy that is like using a blunt instrument to do anything. It's like I've got a hammer and I'll hammer everything as though it's a nail. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter whether you're from the left or the right. The notion of that kind of ideological thinking is totally obsolete, and yet it's a trap. It's a prison of our own invention that we can't escape from. The the illusion that we live in a democracy is scary, because if you believe a democracy is about having your voice heard and being able to vote on issues of concern to you, then when does that happen? It doesn't even happen every 3 years when we elect a government. It doesn't exist.
I never thought I'd ask this. Does this mean that socialism is the answer?
I think what the answer is the need to transcend all those kinds of polarities and through some kind of leap of consciousness see problems in a much more holistic way.
It's something I hadn't thought that we'd talk about tonight, but as you know, there's a big divide in the world at the moment. Left and right politics have become so polarized. Before there was so much, in my opinion, I haven't been around as long as you. I think there's a few decades between us. But certainly in my time, I've seen people go from more centered to more, as we say, politically correct. And as a result, we've now had this polarization of what we're seeing in the West of a big divide in left and right-wing politics. In your research, in your futurist view, where is this going to lead us, Richard?
So in a variety of ways, not just one thing is going to happen, but just at the moment, if we look at Europe in particular, but exists around the world as well, what we're seeing is the political center collapsing. The emergence of very ultra right-wing populism. And it's like a belt around the world now. You've got Bolsonaro, Trump, you've got Prayut in Thailand, you've Duterte in the Philippines, you've got Erdogan in Europe. And there's this right-wing populism, which a lot of people are saying is a bad thing. I actually think it's hastening the collapse of the standard political system. And I think that needs to happen and to allow us to emerge out of the other side with something entirely fresh and relevant for the human family as a whole.
You've mentioned the extreme right, but with respect to the extreme left, so there's a saying that I heard that was quite powerful to me. It said, if you're not on the left when you're young, you don't have a heart. But if you're not on the right when you're old, you don't have a brain.
Yes.
What's your thought on the extreme leftists? We often hear in the mainstream media, extreme right, extreme right, extreme right. But of course, on the other side, certainly in the YouTube space, there is in fact a space to put the microscope on the extreme left that is shoving this down our throat.
Yeah, it's just as bad as the right. And what I'm saying is there is no good way, ideologically speaking, left or right, that dualism is irrelevant these days. It's obsolete. We've got to transcend those kinds of extremes and move into a space which is very much more different. And it's more to do with how can humanity thrive and prosper together within the constraints of the planet, of course, within the constraints of physics.
You mentioned in one of your talks also that it's not actually all doom and gloom. And
No.
that was actually a huge relief to me. And I like what you're talking about hydrogen. Before we move into the crypto space, which I'm very much looking forward to talking about, I'm trying to build a really good foundation and get as much out of you as I possibly can in this time. What do we have to look forward to? What is good in the future?